Hi friends, today we're going to be talking about imperialism. This is taking place at the same time period as our last unit. So last unit we were talking about what was going on with America at home with the industrialization and the moving west and then the progressive era, trying to fix some of those problems that arose from such big change. So now we're going to stay in the same time period, but we're going to look outside and take a look at what happened with America on a global scale. Just a little bit of a heads up, I am not going to provide a lot of notes on my slides, this presentation. I have a lot of political cartoons that I'd like you to analyze. So this is an excellent opportunity, though you may think otherwise, for you to really build on your note-taking skills. Feel free to pause this video when you need to replay parts if you need to catch a key idea you didn't fully grasp or a key concept. Just because I don't want you to think that just because I have not put out words on some of these slides does not mean that I am I'm discussing things that you are not going to be held responsible for later. So feel free to pause whenever you need to, and good luck. So yeah, what we're going to talk about here, imperialism. This really is a huge shift, this time period. Remember, a change over time is one of our key historical skills. And the United States stepping onto a global stage is really a big shift in American foreign policy. You'll remember since about the 1790s, U.S. foreign policy had mainly centered on expanding west and also protecting U.S. interest abroad and limiting foreign influences in America or in the Americas. And so the period after Civil War saw not only the development of a booming industrial economy, but this created the basis for a major shift in U.S. relations with the rest of the world. Instead of a nation that, at least since the War of 1812, had been relatively isolated from European politics, the U.S. became a world power, controlling territories in the Caribbean and extending across the Pacific to the Philippines. And how and why the U.S. acquired an overseas empire and decided to intervene in the affairs of Cuba, Mexico, and other Latin American nations is going to be the focus of our discussion, or the topic of this video today. I do want to point out that this political cartoon shows a caricature that was created by the famous cartoonist Thomas Nast, who you guys read about last unit. Thomas Nast created this character called Uncle Sam. Many of you may be familiar with him, particularly his iconic, the I want you to serve in the U.S. Army poster that we'll talk about when we get to the World Wars. But here you have Uncle Sam, and Uncle Sam is a character that simply represents America. So anytime that you're seeing Uncle Sam in a political cartoon, the cartoonist is making a commentary about America and general feelings in America, and those can be both positive and they can also be negative. So here we have Uncle Sam sitting at a table, ordering off of a menu, and several countries that the United States is going to become involved in are on the menu. So we can't talk about U.S. foreign affairs without talking about this gent. Much of what happens in American foreign policy at the end of the 19th century can be attributed to the work of this man, William Henry Seward. He was a leading Republican of the 1850s and 60s. Seward, who was from New York, served as Secretary of State from 1861 to 69 under both Lincoln and Johnson's presidencies. Seward was probably the most influential Secretary of State since John Quincy Adams. And you'll recall that John Quincy Adams was the mastermind behind the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. And for those of you that may be struggling for what the Monroe Doctrine means or was, the Monroe Doctrine was basically when America came out and said, hey, European nations, we've got the Western Hemisphere. Like, that's going to be our area, and we're going to control that. Like, we're going to protect the Western Hemisphere, and you stay out of here. So that was all John Quincy Adams. And so William H. Seward really becomes influential to American foreign policy. He prevents Great Britain and France from entering the war on the side of the Confederacy during the Civil War. He led the drive to annex Midway Island in the Pacific. He gained the rights to build a canal in Nicaragua, and he purchased the vast territory of Alaska. And though a powerful advocate for expansion, Seward didn't get all he wanted. For example, he failed to convince Congress in his time to annex Hawaii and also to purchase the Danish West Indies. And so just a little bit of an aside on the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine actually gets invoked in right after the American Civil War, when Napoleon III, who is the nephew to the famous Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, took advantage of the U.S.'s involvement in the Civil War and their focus on themselves by sending French troops in to occupy Mexico. And as soon as the Civil War ended in 1865, Seward invoked the Monroe Doctrine and threatened U.S. military action unless the French withdrew. And if Napoleon III backed down and French troops left Mexico. The cartoon that I have here, well, it's not a cartoon, sorry, it's a painting, is this artistic rendering of the French taking Puebla in 1863. I just want you to take a quick look at this. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about sources is perspective. And what perspective do you think the author of this painting had? What nationality do you think the author of this painting was, and why? So take a second and jot that down in your notes. For decades, Russia and Great Britain both claimed the vast territory of Alaska. Russia finally assumed control and established a small colony for seal hunting, but the territory soon became an economic burden because of the constant threat of a British takeover. So seeking buyers, Russia found Seward to be an enthusiastic champion of the idea of the U.S. purchasing Alaska. And as a result of Seward's lobbying and also in appreciation of Russia's support during the Civil War, in 1867, Congress agreed to buy Alaska for $7.2 million. However, for many years, Americans saw no value in Alaska and referred to it derisively as Seward's folly, like his folly is a mistake, or Seward's icebox. Check out this political cartoon on the right. It depicts Seward. He is the man on the right talking to a Russian emissary seen on the left. How do you think Seward is portrayed? What's the artist's depiction of Alaska? What do you think they think about Alaska? I mean, little did Americans know at the time all of the wonderful things that would come out of Alaska, like oil and Sarah Palin. So I guess Seward had the last laugh on that, even though that came out a couple generations after he left office. So the Industrial Revolution America experienced in the late 19th century fueled their involvement in foreign lands. The two are incredibly connected. America looked abroad in order to gain natural resources, which would be used in their industries like rubber, but also since they were producing goods at an increasing rate, they looked abroad for foreign markets, for new people to buy their products. So because of the Industrial Revolution, the U.S. looks abroad for one, natural resources, and two, people to buy their products. In addition, some conservatives in the US were becoming increasingly disturbed over the labor disputes and the unrest of farmers, and hoped that overseas territories and adventurers might offer a safety valve for unhappiness at home, particularly after the Panic of 1893. And you'll recall that that panic was the worst economic downturn that the US had faced up to that point. For the most part, those who advocated for expansionist policies hoped to achieve their ends by economic and diplomatic means, not by military action. Let's take a deeper look into the contributing factors to America's rise America's rise to imperialism. So Darwin, let's talk about Darwin yet again. Darwin's On the Origin of Species didn't just influence people at home in America. The concept of social Darwinism was also applied to competition among nations, races for military advantage, colonies, and spheres of influence. Therefore, in order for America to demonstrate that it was a fit nation and deserved to be on the world stage, Americans believed they needed to acquire new territories overseas. This was very much an extension of the belief in manifest destiny. Also, Americans believed that they had a God-given right to become involved in the Caribbean, Central America, and the Pacific Ocean. Take a look at this political cartoon titled The White Man's Burden, and we'll talk more about the white man's burden in class. It is a poem written by the famous author, especially at the time, Rudyard Kipling. In it, you see two famous characters, John Bull, who represents Britain, and Uncle Sam, which again, as I talked about earlier, represents America. Each man carries a heavy basket filled with people, symbolizing American and Britain's colonies. Take a look at how the people representing the colonies are depicted. Also, make sure you notice the rocks that each man is walking over. What are these men walking towards? What's their goal? So and ultimately, what do you think this cartoon is saying? Particularly given the title, The White Man's Burden. Pause the video for a minute, analyze, and write your answer in your notes. America was actually a bit late to enter the global game. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and other nations struggled to influence or possess other seemingly weaker countries or territories in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Ocean. Just to make sure we're on the same page, when we talk about imperialism, we're talking about the policy of extending a country's power and or influence over another through military force, through colonization, or through other means. So it's essentially like the idea of empire building. Is how I always remember it, because imperialism and empire sound similar. And because other nations were already participating in these policies of imperialism, some Americans believed that they needed to step their game up if they wanted to be seen as a powerful nation. This pro-imperialist faction consisted of missionaries, politicians, naval strategists, and even journalists. So probably the most influential missionary in terms of publishing or pushing an imperialist agenda was a man by the name of Reverend Josiah Strong. And Strong wrote a book in 1885 titled Our Country, Its Possible Future and Present Crisis. And in the book, he explains that people of Anglo-Saxon descent were, quote, the fittest to survive. He believed that Protestant Americans in particular, not just any Americans, not Catholic Americans certainly, but Protestant Americans had a religious duty to colonize other lands in order to spread Christianity and the benefits of their superior civilization to those who were less fortunate. Strong pointed to medicine, science, and technology as evidence of America's superior culture. Many of the missionaries who traveled to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands believed in the racial superiority of whites. Mission activities in local American churches also did much to encourage many average, everyday Americans to support an active U.S. government involvement in foreign affairs. So this justification of imperialism, that God chose white people as a superior group, and as such, it is their duty to protect and look after lesser inferior groups. Hopefully this sounds familiar, because it's certainly not the first time this justification has been used. I want you to think back and synthesize this argument to another group in a different time period. Seriously. Pause the video, think about it for a second. I'll wait. Okay, hopefully you have the answer. We will go over it in class, so I expect you to have it written down. There are multiple answers to that synthesis. There are multiple ways that you could approach it. I'm curious to see what you guys came up with. But let's move on to politicians and their role in increasing the spirit of American imperialism. Many in the Republican Party were close allies with business leaders. Remember, we talked about that at the beginning of last unit, the rise of industrialization, the spoils system, and whatnot. So Republican politicians, therefore, generally endorsed the use of foreign involvement to search for new markets. Congressional leaders like Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts and then Republican governor of New York, Theodore Roosevelt, were eager to build U.S. power through global expansion. Oh, this guy, really important. U.S. Navy Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan. I say Mahan, some people say Mahan. Yeah, it's like Carnegie. Anyway, Mahan. Mahan wrote an important book in 1890 titled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And in it, he argued that a strong navy was crucial to a country's ambitions of securing foreign markets and becoming a world power. Mahan's book was widely read by prominent citizens, as well as by political leaders in both Europe and Japan. Using arguments in Mahan's book, U.S. naval strategists persuaded Congress to finance the construction of a modern steel ships and encourage the acquisition of overseas islands such as Samoa that were desired as coaling and supply stations so the new fleet could protect its sea power around the world. Again, this thought process was the United States wanted to be involved in markets in the Pacific, and they wanted resources that were not just in Africa, but also in Asia. And in order to get to those markets, the United States needed to have access to islands along the way so they could resupply their ships, and so they can keep a close military presence to the Pacific in case somebody were to, say, infringe upon what they would consider their territory or their natural resources. So these islands in the Pacific, like Hawaii, which we'll talk about in a little bit or in another video, become very strategically significant to the United States, not just for their natural resources, but to allow as kind of a jumping off point to get to the rest of the Pacific. And this really was brought about, this strategy and this philosophy was brought about through Mahan's book. And let's see, I have the Great White Fleet mentioned on this slide. The Great White Fleet doesn't happen until about 1907. This is during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. And this is when the United States has this brand new shiny Navy with these US Steel ships, and they tour them around the Pacific. Kind of as a point of pride, but also a little bit like a warning. Like, hey, you guys, take note of our giant ships and our big naval power. We'll talk more about that when we get to Teddy Roosevelt and his foreign policy in, I think, our last video of this series. Okay, so Mahan, super important. What was also important was the promotion of these imperialist ideas through journalism, through newspapers and magazine editors like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer found they could increase circulation by printing adventure stories about distant and exotic places. Stories like this increased public interest and stimulated demands for a larger U.S. role in world affairs. And they were typically printed in newspapers that were called the yellow press or yellow journalism. And since people like Hearst and Pulitzer were more concerned with readership than journalistic integrity, their stories were rarely checked for facts. The title yellow press or yellow journalism comes from the rivalry that developed between Pulitzer's paper, The New York World, and Hearst's paper, The New York Journal. Pulitzer's paper published a famous cartoon called Hogan's Alley, which depicted it had nothing to do with overseas affairs. It depicted life in New York slums. The cartoon was immensely popular and did a lot to increase readership of the paper. And when the comic began printing in color, the lead character, who's pictured here on the left, became known as the Yellow Kid. Hearst then lures the author of the cartoon away from Pulitzer by offering him an extremely large salary. And this rivalry continues. So as you can see on the right, the cartoon becomes the central focus of the paper. Today, people continue to use the word yellow journalism as a derogatory term to sensationalized writing. Synthesis moment. Can you think of any modern day examples of yellow journalism? And make sure that you are not you're not choosing a newspaper or news magazine or a website that isn't satire. So The Onion is not going to count as yellow journalism. So I'm curious how you synthesize that. What are modern day examples of yellow journalism? That is all we're going to talk about for this video. Next video, we are going to discuss what nations the U.S. becomes involved in and the reasons for that and the effects. So more on that later.